Right, welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Yes, we'll be talking about consumer-related matters and a lot more this morning. As you've seen there, Mr. Babatunde Rukera joins us this morning. He is the Executive Vice Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, used to be Council. It's now FCCPC. Good to see you again, sir. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you.
You know, well, I was just talking this morning, there are just several items all over the place you look that a consumer needs help in one way or the other. What is the magnitude of the challenge that your office faces at the moment? Very large.
Wow. The challenge is pretty large. The only thing I would say is we're digging from far below, and we still are making some progress. Two things. Increasing consumer dissatisfaction is a factor of two things in Nigeria. It is a reflection of the quality of services or goods that they receive on the one hand, but on a slightly positive hand is the fact that it's also a reflection of increasing discrimination by consumers and feelings of aggravation because they're becoming more aware. And to some extent, they're finding out there are at least channels to express that dissatisfaction, whether it's a regulatory channel or a name and shame, the social media. And so what it is that the combination of these two things show a prognosis of some future of positivity. But I would still say that on two grounds, with respect to how businesses treat their customers, on the whole, is still a failing grade. With respect to the quality, the scope, and the intensity of regulatory responses, I would say we've come up some way, but the playing field is still extremely large, and there's still a lot to cover.
You know, because maybe I should even ask, I mean, what did you find as the main challenge, the main reason why these things happen? Because sometimes it comes across as though these organizations feel they can do all of these things and get away with it and nothing happens.
Three things. The most important component of any robust right enforcement framework is a discriminatory consumer, people who demand on their rights and insist. And so a lack of awareness of your rights is number one. And number two is a corporate culture of not caring one way or the other. Number three is a history where that hasn't been the core of regulatory focus. And so, for instance, in aviation, we've worked so hard to regulate safety. In food and drugs, we've worked so hard to regulate the food security, drug security, making sure that there are no fakes, the active ingredient in medication is appropriate. But we have not really paid attention to consumer behavior, consumer protection. And I keep saying that at the end of the day, consumer protection should not be ancillary to business. It must be the core of the business. It doesn't matter whether it's power, it doesn't matter whatever it is. Consumers are the core of the business. And so that orientation is taking time. I mean, even in fast-moving consumer goods, I once ran a poll, and I engaged some of the executives of some of the major multinationals in fast-moving goods, especially food. And what we did was we bought cartons or boxes of their products from the Middle East, from Dubai, from England, from the US. And we saw that on the pack itself, there was a guidance to consumers on how to complain if they were displeased and who on the other side would respond. But for the same businesses, the same packs, the same brands, in Nigeria, there was nothing. There was no information. So they were not providing information at all. And so all that culture needs to change.
I have a theory, and you can tell me how much of my theory is correct. I'm going to say that, let's say the corporate culture of many institutions derive from how they perceive that the Nigerian government treats its own citizens. I do not know whether this also falls under the jurisdiction of the FCCPC, but if people complain, for instance, of not getting government services, can they come to you? And if the corporate environment senses that these people don't even, the government doesn't really care about them, why should we? We're just selling stuff to them.
And so there is a part of that could be arguably, potentially correct, but it doesn't end there. To the question about whether we regulate government also, when the government engages in commerce, if you provide services for benefit, whether it's transport services or whatever it is, then we engage. Now, when the government provides services as a government responsibility, that's not commerce. That's
like water,
even water could be commerce if there's a charge and a fee when it's privatized. Yeah. Okay. But when for something like law enforcement or maybe a passport issuance and all of that, we get engaged, we engage, but that's not a core mandate. In those cases, you go to Servicom. The government itself has an internal mechanism to hold itself accountable. Sure. But primarily, consumer protection by the FCCPC is for commerce. And so to the question about whether companies treat people in the manner that their government allow, government has a role in making sure that the people are treated with respect. No question about that. But there's absolutely nothing that will excuse a corporate behavior, because in reality, it's commerce. There is a commercial contract between a company and its consumers and a social pact. And you owe that consumer a responsibility. Now, the government's failure, if at all, is that we do not have the most robust consequence management system. But in reality, companies understand that their brands depend on what their consumers, what their customers feel about their brands. Mm. And so it is even more important that you have consumers who are willing to insist on their rights and to hold companies accountable to themselves, much more than it is that you have a government that will jump on your back, because that will not be consistent.
So it would seem that consumers begin to realize, I mean, as you said, we have very poor consequence management. And yes, while consumers might want to exercise their rights, to get better services, etc., they've since found out that, even when they complain, there is not much that is done. Or there's very little that can be done, especially if these services are needed by, by the companies that provide them. If those people are, close to monopolies as can be, there's only very little that can, come off their complaints. So I don't know how this will work. Maybe that's why you see people resorting more to social media to see if they can name and shame and maybe get more people on their side. But very rarely is it happening that, when people complain, especially about big companies who do not really rely on retail consumers, to make a profit. Maybe I'm underestimating that. But maybe look to fellow companies like themselves for them to make a huge turnover. How do we then, begin to protect the rights of the smaller entities to ensure that their rights are not trampled upon? And
so you said two things. There's a consumer protection aspect of that, and then there's a competitive market aspect of that, and both of them are within the mandate of the FCCPC. And I'd say that the FCCPA, which is the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, is less than 5 years old. It was enacted in January of 2019. Prior to that, we had the Consumer Protection Council Act, and so the FCCPC used to be the CPC. I would say that some of the growth we've experienced is because there was that change in legislation, and it's actually been phenomenal. And so it takes time. And the market Nigeria is a very large and very robust economy. And most of these businesses had been doing their business in a certain way. Especially businesses were extremely vertically integrated. Businesses provided their own infrastructure, they have their own transport system, and so their whole supply chain, to some extent, depended on them. And each of those pieces have competition implications. For instance, if you're a manufacturer of a fast-moving product, but you have a very large transportation distribution network, it has become a facility that others should be able to use. And so one day at a time, and when you have a new competition regulation, you don't just go into the market and deconstruct what has existed. So it's going to take time. And I can assure you that companies are becoming far more conversant with the fact that there is a regulatory framework that's holding them accountable. But, you know, like everything else, you're going to keep putting in and putting in and putting in before you begin to see the best results. And from a consumer protection standpoint, I would say to you that we're seeing a lot more companies now in the FCCPC than we ever saw in the CPC. I took on the role when it was still the CPC, so I've seen the transition, I've seen the migration, and I can tell you that the responsiveness of companies to the regulatory process has gone up. What we need to do is to make sure that companies also ultimately imbibe the culture that the regulatory system should not be where you're most responsive. The regulatory system should be, because how many cases will come to the regulator? Yeah. You must be responsive to people so that you don't even get through the regulatory system.
Well, talking about pharmaceuticals, I mean, I get to hear several cases where they say, look, there are some pharmaceuticals, there are some pharmacies, supermarkets who are selling expired products that they doctor some of those labels on them, and so people may not necessarily know. So in that kind of case, who do they report to? Is it yourself, your office, or
multiple places, multiple places to go for that. NAFDAC for one, the FCCPC, and in any case, the alteration of an expiration date or key features of the label is actually a crime. And so even if you reported that to the police, that's obviously something, because we take that as a law enforcement issue, not just a regulatory issue. We would prosecute when we find that.
So some specific cases now. The one about the hospital, Mayfield, I believe, because we also saw it online where the people had said, well, the individual sustained injuries while on the bike and then got to the hospital and then had this asthma attack, and the hospital didn't have any facility specifically for that particular case. And so they, from what they published, I say that the individual died as a result of that particular scenario. But it may be complicated now, but you're involved in that matter. What can you tell us about it?
So what we can say is that we became aware of this incident, and we've paid quite some attention to the healthcare value chain, as you probably know, and conducted some investigations in that area. We introduced the Patient's Bill of Rights, which we enforce and work with others to enforce. And in this particular case, what we understand is that there was a vehicular accident that included these riders, and one of the riders was transported to the hospital by the operatives of the Federal Road Safety Corps. And what happened between when he arrived at the hospital and when he ultimately passed away, the nature of the injuries, and all that's quite controversial. And so we've gone in and we're conducting an investigation. The one thing I know from just being a litigator and also engaging in these types of things is that an accident, I mean, visible injuries may not speak to the totality of what the nature of injuries are. Now, and then many times in an emergency, it's a race against time. So it's the timeliness of the emergency intervention, the urgency of the care, and where necessary, escalation or referral that will matter. And so it might very well be that this hospital didn't have, maybe the story is true, that this person ultimately died of an asthma. It might very well be. And it might not be. Now, if it is, it might not necessarily mean that something went wrong. And if it is not, it doesn't mean that something didn't go wrong. For instance, even if that wasn't the case, what care did this fellow get? What kind of responsiveness? What sense of urgency did this facility demonstrate? And we've executed a search on the facility to get as much information as we can. We would ultimately get into the question of the medical notes will show whether he had an asthmatic attack or not, and what medications were administered or not. We've asked for the inventory of what the hospital had at the time, and then several pieces of evidence that we would be looking at over the coming weeks. We would be speaking to a lot of other people also, including the Road Safety Corps operatives. And typically, an investigation of this nature will make it public. The law requires some of our investigations to be public, but we're more concerned about investigations in the healthcare, because the government is coming from a position, and even the entire industry, is coming from a position of significant trust deficit in the public. And so, and because in things of this nature, they're sensitive. You can't tell what went wrong or what didn't go wrong. The only way to make sure that everybody can sign up to the conclusion and agree with it, whether they, and respect it, whether they agree with it or not, is that there's a transparent, open investigation. Because even when something is transparently investigated, if you don't like the outcome, you at least accept it. And so we would make this quite public so people would know.
Do you have a timeline that you're working with?
Typically, we cannot say one way or the other, but this one seems to have progressed quite quickly. Executing a search on the hospital that quickly and gathering the amount of information we have is an indication that this would not be a very long investigation. We've also been in contact with the Medical and Dental Council of Nigeria to at least advise them and let them know. And we've made sure that the nature of this investigation is not complicated. It's purely the consumer protection investigation. We're not trying to determine whether any medical or other professional acted ethically in accordance with their professional code or not, which is probably one that is more contentious. So I would say it won't be that long.
Well, how do we get it when you publish this? What platforms are you going to publish it on?
Typically, healthcare investigations, especially when it results in fatalities, it's public. It would even be on live television.
Oh, okay. Good, because people need to see some of these things. And then there's also this particular case that came up with Disco, Ikeja Disco. They sent me messages to persons who couldn't access. They thought, look, what's going on? Is there anything happening here? But a good thing that you're also aware on that particular matter, because at the time, they said they couldn't get any of those tokens, as it were. But much later, after the time had elapsed, they were able to get access. What did you find when you looked into it?
So here's what we found, and the complaint was that people were not able to vend. And there was an allegation that it was potentially pending a change in tariff. And so what we did was to put out a statement and saying, Ikeja, you better beware. And not just because of Ikeja, but it's also putting out those statements. It's not just information to the public, it's also the signal to everybody else. There are how many discos in the country? They should know that anybody who does this is swimming in dangerous waters. And we engaged Ikeja. And our ultimate understanding was that there was also an intensity in vending. People who also anticipated that the tariff may change also wanted to stock up and save, as a forestalling.
Which was what a number of discos advised. We can confidently say that Abuja Disco advised its customers to stock up pending this particular increment.
Some did.
Yeah, pending this, how will I put it now, expectation of increment in tariff. So, that was what they were telling their customers, advising them to save money ahead of time when they thought it was good. So why would a disco not prepare for an increment, for an increased, traffic on its website as a result of people trying to just save a few bucks,
And that's an important point. But in the absence of something that is objectively uniform, you cannot hold one person accountable. I don't know why Abuja Disco said that to their customers. There was absolutely no clarity. As far as we know, there was no statement about an increase in tariff. And Ikeja could have been operating from the standpoint of, we don't know that there will be an increase in tariff. And so they didn't advise their customers to stock up, and they did. And from what we also heard, many of the vendors are third-party agents. And so it's really how much they put in their wallet that they're able to vend. So a lot of the vending delays were from these third-party agents who had run out of units to vend out. And so I don't exonerate Ikeja Disco, but it seems to us from our engagement with them that they didn't hold back vending privileges on account of a potential increase. Now, the failure result in another type of consumer frustration that they should address, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, what it shows is the fundamental infrastructural weaknesses in their vending apparatus. Because why should we be having a conversation about whether consumers have an opportunity to vend or not? If their apparatus, if their infrastructure works well, it really shouldn't matter. If any consumer wants to vend ₦1 million at any time, they should be able to vend ₦1 million. Why are you restricting the ability or the discretion of consumers to vend? But the point that I was making is ultimately we didn't find any credible evidence that this was preemptive, that they restrained consumers preemptively so they could make more money in a matter of days. But with the subject of whether their infrastructure or their vending apparatus is sufficiently robust for consumers, that's a continuing discussion.
All right, let's bring in our colleagues in Lagos. Go ahead, guys.
All right, thank you, Chamberlain. And this naturally leads me to that question about the quality of service consumers receive from distribution companies. I just saw on one of the front pages, Nigerian News Direct, that about 5.9 million consumers were billed incorrectly, according to a report. So there's a talk about even increasing tariffs. And usually what you hear the customers, both households and companies, says, we're not even getting quality, we're not getting constant electricity supply. So which will come first? Better quality or higher tariffs?
I'm lost.
I hope you got that, Sarah Kara.
I didn't get the end of it, but I got most of it. I think the question comes down to...
No, the question is which will come first?
Service quality.
Yeah, better service, yes, or increased tariff in this case.
And honestly, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive, and I don't even think one goes before the other. The reality of it is that if people are paying for something, they should be getting the right quality of it. Now, the question of tariff, that's a commercial issue. That's a question. That's a value proposition of whether the right price for a service is what the prevailing rate is. And there are two things that I'm concerned as a consumer protection advocate. One, consumers should not overpay. And so for that, on the estimated billing, I can say without any question about what the tariff is, we absolutely reject this continuing estimated billing. And we understand that it's something that could take time to conclude, but that window needs to narrow very quickly. And the billing framework needs to be such that it does not provide an additional benefit to the discos. They should not be able to make more money because of estimated billing. It should be either that they make less or they make exactly what it would have been under a tariff. Now, with respect to fixing tariff, there's a methodology to that. There is a regulator who does that, and so we don't have that competence, we don't have the mandate, and we certainly don't have the skills to be able to determine what the tariff should be. The only thing that provides some level of comfort to us as consumer regulators, protection regulators, and someone checking to make sure that people are not charged excessively for what they take, is that when there's a regulator who participates in tariff setting, it provides at least some comfort that it is not likely that consumers will be exploited from what those tariffs are. Now, does that eliminate the hardship that consumers experience? No, not necessarily. The hardship is a different thing. Exploitation is a different thing. And I think both of them are important discussions. I think consumers must not be exploited and should not experience hardship.
Because for a lot of people, they feel they're being overcharged anyway, since they're not getting quality service. So if the tariffs go up, that's like double jeopardy for them. But you raise a very important point about regulation. I see on social media, FCCPC being tagged to literally everything. Landlord-tenant issues, they tag you. Different issues, maybe because you've been quite responsive, to those issues. But there are regulators. For the electricity sector, there's NERC. For telecommunications, there's the NCC. Even for this, hospital issues, you have regulatory bodies that are tasked with that responsibility. So why is that the case? Is it that the regulatory bodies are not doing what they ought to do right, such that people say, if you won't listen to us, let's just go to the FCCPC, because it would look like you might be overwhelmed at this rate?
I mean, I would say we do get a lot of work. And so what it is that consumer protection is not our core mandate. It is our exclusive mandate in addition to competition. But for some of these regulators, they have a mandate, and consumer protection is just an additional component of their mandate. And so it could be a resource allocation issue for those regulators, whereas for us, our entire resources are dedicated to regulating competition in the marketplace and consumer protection. But I would say that the totality of the regulatory capacity that exists for consumer protection in the country is still very small compared to what the real scope of commerce is. And the way we would succeed is making sure that the responsibility for responsiveness and sensitivity must move to the businesses. It is absolutely inappropriate that consumers can find me easier than they can find the business that sold a product to them. And what I've continued to say to the business is that the government is subsidizing your business. You've literally made the FCCPC a multi-company customer service desk. And we continue to say these, and we continue to tell companies at some point that's going to stop. And really, really soon, we're close to writing regulations that makes us abundantly a secondary level complaint resolution mechanism, in which case it's only complaints that companies do not respond to that we would respond to. And when we resolve complaints on behalf of companies, we'll make the companies pay for it. Companies need to have their own stand-alone complaint resolution mechanisms to serve their customers. And when they advertise their products, they need to advise the customers exactly what to do when they're dissatisfied, when they want feedback.
Right.
Most of the companies that we've engaged don't have stand-alone complaint resolution mechanisms. It's tied into some customer service or feedback mechanism. And so the government, so the companies look bad, they make the government look bad, and everybody looks bad. And so we must move to that point where it's the companies that people are reaching out to when they're dissatisfied. The government should not be mediating literally every complaint about airtime, about a failed transaction, about a short fill in a drink. There's nowhere in the world where those kinds of frameworks succeed.
Well, it also points to the fact that a lot of these regulators have a lot of work to do, because you can't expect the companies to also regulate themselves. You know what to expect from that. But we're due for a break right now. The usual suspects, they would say, the aviation sector, for example, the loan apps conversation, we'll come to that in a moment. It's a big one, definitely. So that's in a moment. Stay with us. Back. We're talking consumer protection and competition this morning, but consumer protection is always a big one because we're seeing there are more consumers than the companies that provide services and goods. And we're still being joined by Mr. Babatunde Irukera, who is the Executive Vice Chair and the CEO of the FCCPC, speaking with us from our Abuja studios. Thank you so much for staying with us. I was going to enter the realm of aviation sector, which has been giving a lot of people headaches. Not of late, really, for quite some time now. And just recently, the NCA released that report about cancelled and delayed flights. And, according to that report, we saw that Air Peace operated the most with 6,521 flights, out of which about 57% were delayed. Also, Max Air recorded high flight delays, even for cancellations as well. You saw those airlines also cancelling most of the flights. And you fly a lot. A lot of Nigerians fly a lot. And we know that you can almost predict that your flight will be delayed maybe 8 out of 10 times. Now, what the figure says, about 6 out of 10 times. It looks like it's not really getting better, honestly, because if that's the figure for first quarter of 2023, you wonder, what's going on, really?
Well, if the airline operating community is not embarrassed by this, and I honestly don't know what could possibly embarrass anybody, because it is actually a dismal, extremely dismal performance to say that the airline that operates the most flights in the country on a daily basis would have 58% of its flights delayed or cancelled. And that's one of the better performances. I think IBOM was identified as the one with the best performance at 35%, which is incredibly high. You're saying that more than a third of the flights are either delayed or cancelled. And all you need to do is to extrapolate that and just think about how much resource the country loses, how much time we're wasting, how many appointments are missed, how many appointments are delayed, and you can't even begin to capture the full extent of what kind of a loss of work time and labor time to a country this must be. And I think it calls for a far more serious conversation. As a matter of fact, internally in the FCCPC, as we read this report, what we did was we immediately reach out to our colleagues at the Civil Aviation Authority. So we're going to have to sit down and come to some understanding on what works and what doesn't work. But I think that what NCA has done is the first shot at what works. I think even providing this information, data, you can't go wrong when you have accurate data. So providing the information and for each of the airlines to see what their performances are is a starting point. One of the most important conversations we had continued to have is that we need this type of information. We don't need it annually. We need to be able to put things out there, to put a display and show consumers that this is how the airlines are performing on a daily basis, so that consumers determine how to hedge their bets and what risks to take with respect to what airline to travel with. And once we start to do that, it will motivate the airlines to be far more. I expect this report alone to create some level of introspection and reflection amongst the airlines. And they're going to have to sit and want to be amongst the best. And so I think that this step itself, as alarming as it is, for us, is a very important step. And I think it's the beginning of an accountability framework that hopefully would make things better. I recognize that there are many issues and infrastructure deficits and all of that, but nothing, absolutely nothing can explain the sheer magnitude of these delays and failures. And like we've always said, delays and cancellations in air travel are inevitable, even from a safety standpoint, inevitable. There are all kinds of things, I mean, a snag on an aircraft, weather, that make it unsafe to fly. And I'm almost certain, just like me, nobody, no passenger wants to fly when it's unsafe. As a matter of fact, when there's a problem and you reassure them it's safe to fly, they still say, no, I'm not convinced. And so nobody wants to fly when it's unsafe, and will understand when the delays are limited to legitimate circumstances. But what needs to happen more is even some level of transparency and communication. Tell them the truth and comply with the law. Let people know ahead of time, and don't have people sitting at the airports having to go to the counters repeatedly to ask questions. But this doesn't happen with domestic airlines alone. I was traveling over the weekend between Switzerland and Nigeria, and I wanted to change my departure flight from Geneva to London. I was traveling on British Airways. I'm calling them out, and I didn't get any notification that said my flight had been cancelled. I just went online and Google, type in, tell me how many departures British Airways has from Geneva to London, because I wanted to see which was an earlier one that I could go fly standby, only to see that the flight that I was going to be on in less than 24 hours was cancelled. I didn't know. And so I had to activate a process. If I didn't do this by myself, I would not be sitting here this morning. I would only just be arriving in Nigeria this morning. It would have cost me another 24 hours or more to arrive in. And so this is a problem that's global. The scale of it is problematic in Nigeria. And I believe that what NCA has done is an incredibly bold and courageous step to hold the airlines accountable. So I think we're on to better days.
All right, so what do you do with insurance? Because several people too feel that a lot should be done in that sector, because people sign on insurance packages, they don't get anything whatsoever. Do you experience any challenge in that area?
Absolutely. I mean, on a daily basis, we get complaints about the people who've paid their premiums, and when the time comes for an insurance to pay out, or when the life cycle of a policy has come up, insurance companies don't pay out. And we're handling those complaints on a daily basis. We've had a conversation, multiple conversations with the core regulator, the Insurance Commission. In fact, we have a mutual understanding with them for resolving these complaints and holding the insurance companies accountable, and that's going on. But again, like I said, the success of a consumer protection regulatory framework is not the speed of resolving complaints. It's really eliminating as much of these basic complaints as possible. And I think the steps that are started happening in the insurance industry has reduced some of this. Has been consolidation, and we're beginning to see those consolidations begin to materialize, because it was, you know, and what the complaints also tell us is it is an indication of the stress test of an industry. And so it could show that insurance companies were becoming cash-strapped if they were not paying at the end of policies, but the consolidation is beginning to reduce that.
Okay. So I'd like to know, so, I mean, considering the scope of work that you have to do, I imagine that, you know, money is going to also go into, and you will certainly need to be financed. How is that working for the FCCPC? And so
the FCCPC, starting from CPC even into the FCCPC, was a treasury-funded agency. But we've completely migrated, and as of this year, it's fully self-funded. It's payroll, that is personnel cost, it's capex, it's capital expenditure, and it's overhead, all completely fully funded, and we return money to the government. We give 40% of our income to the government, and at the end of the year, whatever we do not, whatever is extra budgetary for us, the government still takes it. And I'm proud to say that we've succeeded as a self-funded agency. As a self-funded agency, we've been able to do more than we were able to do when we were self-funded. And what that means for companies is that you now have a regulator who's going to hold you accountable, because holding you accountable is the source of his own livelihood. And I agree with that. I completely agree with that model. I think the government should be able to focus its resources on a lot of other things than funding regulators who are regulating businesses. There's no reason why the government should be paying for the malfeasance of businesses. The businesses should be held responsible for their own malfeasance. So
it is in the interest of the regulator to actually look in your business. If you are not responsive, they will be responsive to your unresponsiveness.
Oh, if you're not responsive, you cut out a check.
Wow. But are you required by law to refund money to government, return money?
I mean, the law says that you're responsible for your revenue. However, what it says is that you have a budget. Whatever, I mean, and budget is different from revenue. That you make money doesn't mean you must spend all of your money. Your budget must still be based on what are your real, true, reasonable needs. And so whatever is in excess of those needs, it's not your money, right? It's the money of the federal government.
So what I'm wondering now is, because when you make money, when you now become a self-funded agency, and yes, indeed, there is good incentive for you to be very interested in malfeasance and the irresponsiveness of government, of you know, corporate bodies to their customers. But then, you know, people also say that tendency for abuse could also arise within the FCCPC. Is it something you've considered, and what checks are you putting in place?
And that is the case. I mean, the tendency for abuse, you certainly don't want an agency of this that regulates commerce and that does such sensitive work to begin to become a revenue-generating agency, looking to whack people just because that's the only way they can make their own pay. And so there is the potential. Now, I won't say tendency. There is the potential, but I would say that our approach to our work, and even the companies will tell you, the biggest penalties wouldn't be from small errors. We're not walking around looking for people who, but there, you know, especially in the competition aspect, there are things that you do that globally you recognize if you snooze, you're going to lose. And that's where the big ticket items will come from. Indeed, as it were today, to show you that we're not going out there to, we do not charge, other than merger notification fees. With the consumer protection aspect, there's not one fee. No registration fees, no licensing, no approval. We don't register products. We don't do anything. We don't take any money from companies. We don't approve any products. We don't do anything. The only time you would have a problem with the FCCPC and you have to cut a check, other than if you're merging, as of today, is you've done something wrong. And doing that thing wrong is not that we just show up and say you've done something wrong. We carry out a broad investigation. You're confronted with it. We make an order. You don't agree. You've got your rights to appeal. But if you choose not to appeal, you come to terms with your malfeasance and deal with it at the FCCPC.
And it doesn't look like the FCCPC is about to start losing money, because there are so many infractions in this country, almost everywhere, and that is really, really sad. Yes.
And you're right. However, the focus, especially with consumer protection, The focus is corrective measures.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, the cost and the resource for those investigations can make it even negative when you think about, I mean, what's the fine you're going to impose when you allocate all these resources for an investigation when they could be doing a bunch of other things, especially when you're not paying your own salaries. Every man hour means a lot to you. Yeah. So you want to allocate those resources in the most productive way.
So you also looked into the POS, because there's this group, I think they had, I don't know if they formed a group or something, they issued a statement that they were going to fix prices, and people thought, even the CBN had to speak up at some point. What are you doing in that regard?
And again, when it comes, Nigeria is a free market. And that means price is something that is negotiated in the marketplace. So we don't fix prices generally. However, a fair price is the price that is negotiated in an undistorted market. And so if a group of competitors on the platform of an association, which is a good thing for them to have an association, come together and decide on price, that's a distorted market. That price can never, ever be a fair price. The input costs are different. I might operate my business right outside my door, in which case I don't pay rent. You have your business down the road, you pay rent, you transport yourself. Those input costs are different. I use a different type of car from you. I consume much more fuel than you. Those input costs are different. Your pricing model should be based on your input cost and whatever margins you consider satisfactory to you. I would do the same. That's what competitors do. And that's why they compete for the custom of the consumers. You price in a way where you're giving an innovation, efficiency, all those things affect price. And so when you on a platform say this is going to be the price, what you're doing is not even good for some of the competitors. You're not encouraging those who are efficient and innovative because their price is going to be the same as those who don't do anything. And it's certainly not good for consumers. So what we've said is you cannot fix the price. Let each person determine what price they want to charge, and people would go to where they feel most satisfied.
One more sector, the banks. Because that's where all over social media you get to see people are complaining everywhere you turn. Even as I sit now, if I go check my phone, I could see some charges coming through that I don't understand what some of these things are. How are you able to deal with that?
The banks are one of the bigger problems, I must say that.
Just before you speak to, I want to ask you, which one of the sectors is your biggest headache? Is it the banks or the telcos?
Power, electricity.
Oh. Okay. So they take the cake.
They take the cake.
So they're first. Who's second?
Banks.
Banks. And third?
Aviation.
Aviation. Interesting. So telcos...
Telcos used to be second, third, but progressively...
They improved.
I don't know if it's that they've gotten better or others have gotten worse.
So let's deal with number two. Yes.
The banks. And so the banking industry is quite complex because you've got two key regulators, the central bank and in fact, one key regulator, as it were, because the current law, that is the Bank and Other Financial Institutions Act of 2020, excludes the FCCPA, which is the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, in some aspect. It's contentious, one way or the other, but we've continued to resolve complaints in the banks because they're the second largest. And all we just consider is if we stopped doing that and said, well, the law, we can go focus our resources on something else. But just like you said, look at the sheer number of people who the CBN would have to deal with or probably would not be able to conclude dealing with. So we've stayed in the banking sector and using moral suasion and then using other instruments of law to justify or legitimize our engagement. And many of the banks do respond. I suspect also because of our reputation, and then hardly any of the banks is willing to roll the dice by going to court to say that we do not have the jurisdiction or the powers. And if any of them would do that, we would go to court, and hopefully they would learn very quickly how that outcome could be for them and for others. But one thing is very clear, and one of the things we've strongly advocated is that banks need to have, the entire financial system, need to have some other service level understanding between themselves and the payment systems. And so that the front end of transactions that don't go well will not be the customers getting the short end of the stick. For instance, if you're paying for a ticket and the money has left your bank account, the understanding for the settlement should be between the bank and the payment gateway that they choose to use, not you who doesn't get your ticket and has lost your money. And I think if we move to that, because most of the complaints with the banking system now are electronic transactions. And so if we can just go to a more methodical process for that, I believe that we would solve most of the problems.
All right, I'm afraid we need to go, but I see Bakar saying after 2 court judgments, customs still charge duties on personal effects of arriving travelers in our airports. This has been brought to the attention of FCCPC in Nigeria, but it continues. Are you aware of this?
So that would be forwarded from us to customs and Servicom, because customs doesn't know, it's not in commerce.
Okay. All right, we do thank you for coming on, Babatunde Irukara, Executive Vice Chairman, Chief Executive of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, FCCPC. Thank you for coming on, and all the best to you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you.
All right, we will be back in just a moment. We'll have Pastor Ikeja Disco joining us next. Find out what he's going to talk about. Don't go away.